A 6-year-old girl walked into a police station before sunrise and asked for something that would shock an entire city. What happened next exposed a secret hidden behind one of America's most admired parenting influencers and revealed a nightmare that had been disguised as discipline for years. The morning began quietly in Albuquerque, New Mexico. The streets were still half asleep when a small figure appeared outside the entrance of a local police station. Wrapped in a faded gray sweater and clutching a worn teddy bear against her chest, the little girl looked completely out of place. She was alone. No parent. No older sibling. No adult anywhere in sight. Officers inside immediately noticed her. Children her age were usually brought to the station by worried parents after getting lost in a shopping center or wandering away from home. This child was different. She moved with unusual purpose, as if every step had been carefully planned long before the sun came up. The girl's name was Juniper Hale. She was only 6 years old, yet the expression on her face looked decades older. There was no confusion in her eyes. No panic. No tears. Instead, there was something far more disturbing. Relief. As if simply reaching the police station was the greatest achievement of her young life. Detectives quickly realized they were not dealing with an ordinary runaway situation. Juniper appeared calm beyond her years. She knew her address by memory. She knew exactly how far she had traveled. She could describe street names, intersections, and landmarks with astonishing precision. For a moment, some officers were impressed. Then they learned why. Juniper explained that she had spent years being forced to memorize everything. Mistakes were unacceptable. Forgetfulness was punished. Every detail had to be perfect. The admiration instantly turned into concern. Child protection specialists were called in immediately. As investigators sat down with Juniper, pieces of a horrifying picture slowly emerged. While other children spent their days playing, making friends, and discovering the world, Juniper lived according to a schedule so strict that every minute of her life was controlled. She woke up before most adults. She studied subjects designed for teenagers. She followed rules that seemed impossible even for trained soldiers. There were rules about speaking, rules about standing, rules about eating, rules about making eye contact, rules about showing emotion. The most frightening part was that Juniper recited them effortlessly, as if they had been carved into her mind. The child never hesitated, never stumbled, never needed to think. Every answer came instantly. That alone told investigators something was terribly wrong. The deeper they looked, the more alarming the situation became. Juniper described a home where cameras watched nearly every room. A place where affection had conditions attached to it. A place where being tired was treated like failure, and where childhood itself was considered a weakness. Every new detail tightened the knot forming in the investigators' stomachs. What kind of mother would create such an environment? The answer surprised everyone. Juniper's mother was not hiding in the shadows. She was famous. Vivian Hale had built a massive online following by presenting herself as a parenting expert. Through videos, interviews, and social media content, she promoted what she called elite discipline and advanced child development. Thousands of parents admired her. Many considered her an example. Some even paid for her advice. To the outside world, Vivian appeared intelligent, confident, and dedicated to raising exceptional children. But inside the interview room, investigators were beginning to suspect that the reality behind those polished videos was something much darker. As Juniper continued sharing pieces of her daily life, the room grew quieter. No one interrupted. No one reached for coffee. No one checked their phones. The officers simply listened. And with every minute, the urgency increased. This was no longer a question of strict parenting. This was becoming a race against time. Because one statement from Juniper changed everything. The little girl revealed that she had not come to the police station because she wanted attention. She had not come because she was angry. She had not come because she wanted revenge. She had come because she believed that if she stayed in that apartment any longer, something terrible would eventually happen to her. For the first time since arriving, fear appeared in her eyes. Not fear of strangers. Not fear of police. Fear of going back home. That single realization hit everyone in the room harder than any evidence ever could. Within minutes, emergency procedures were activated. Investigators prepared to visit the apartment. Child welfare officials began building a protection case. Medical evaluations were arranged. And while the adults rushed into action, Juniper sat quietly in her chair, holding her battered teddy bear. She looked exhausted. Not like a child who had stayed up too late. Not like a child who had walked across town. She looked exhausted from carrying a burden no 6-year-old should ever have to carry. Outside, the sun was finally beginning to rise over Albuquerque. Inside the police station, an investigation was unfolding that would soon capture national attention, divide public opinion, and expose a shocking truth hidden behind fame, influence, and the illusion of perfect parenting. And this was only the beginning. Less than an hour after Juniper arrived at the police station, Detective Marisol Keene was already heading toward the apartment where the 6-year-old had spent her entire life. The urgency was impossible to ignore. Every instinct told the investigators that what they were dealing with was far more serious than an overly strict parent. Child Protective Services Specialist Rowan Blake accompanied the team. Neither of them spoke much during the drive. Both were reviewing the details Juniper had provided. The precision of the girl's memory was unsettling. Every room, every schedule, every camera, every punishment. No 6-year-old should have been able to describe her life with that level of accuracy. As their vehicle pulled into the apartment complex, the building appeared completely ordinary. Clean sidewalks, fresh paint, well-maintained landscaping. Nothing about the place hinted at the disturbing reality investigators suspected was waiting inside. But appearances had already become a major theme in this case. The public image of Vivian Hale looked perfect too. The officers approached the 8th floor and arrived outside apartment 804. Everything felt strangely quiet. No television sounds. No music. No signs of a family home. When the door finally opened, Vivian appeared exactly as she did in her online videos. Confident. Well-dressed. Composed. Her expression barely changed when she saw the investigators. The calmness immediately caught Marisol's attention. Most parents would have panicked after discovering their 6-year-old child had disappeared before dawn. Vivian seemed more irritated than worried. That reaction alone raised even more questions. The investigators entered the apartment. Within seconds, they realized something was terribly wrong. The place did not feel like a home. It felt like a controlled environment. The walls were dominated by neutral colors. Everything was arranged with almost unnatural precision. There were no family photos. No children's drawings. No stuffed animals. No signs of imagination. No signs of childhood. Every object appeared positioned according to a strict system. Even the silence felt calculated. Marisol slowly moved through the living room while Rowan documented everything. Then they found the study area. The sight stopped them cold. A massive schedule covered one wall. Every hour of Juniper's day had been planned. Every activity. Every lesson. Every minute. Wake up. Exercise. Mathematics. Advanced English. Science. Memory drills. Behavior correction. Performance evaluations. The schedule extended from early morning until evening. The amount of work expected from a 6-year-old was staggering. Rowan immediately began photographing everything. The deeper they looked, the worse it became. Several cameras were mounted throughout the apartment. One in the main study area. Another in the hallway. Another facing Juniper's bedroom. Additional recording equipment was hidden in locations that allowed nearly constant monitoring. The child had been under surveillance almost every waking moment. Marisol felt a growing sense of anger. This wasn't supervision. This was control. The investigators continued searching. Inside a cabinet, they found stacks of notebooks. Hundreds of pages. Each one dedicated to Juniper. Every mistake she made had been documented. Every emotional reaction. Every hesitation. Every complaint. Each entry was treated like a defect that needed correction. The language inside the notebooks was chilling. There were references to weakness, failure, defiance, mental conditioning, behavioral adjustment. The terminology sounded less like parenting and more like someone conducting a long-term experiment. Then they discovered something even more disturbing. A locked office inside the apartment. After obtaining authorization, investigators opened the room. Several computer monitors illuminated the darkness. External hard drives filled entire shelves. Folders covered the desk. At first glance it resembled the workspace of a content creator. Then technicians began opening files. Thousands of videos appeared. Thousands. The recordings showed Juniper studying, writing, reciting information, completing assignments, being corrected, being monitored, being evaluated. The footage spanned years. The little girl had essentially been living inside a permanent recording studio. Marisol watched one clip after another. The same pattern repeated constantly. Pressure. Correction. Control. Perfektion. Pressure again. There was never any laughter. Never any play. Never any freedom. The child appeared more like an employee than a daughter. One technician finally uncovered a folder that changed the entire investigation. Its title was simple. Project Ascension. The files inside outlined Vivian's long-term plan. Page after page detailed her goal of creating what she described as an exceptional child. There were charts, development targets, performance measurements, behavioral observations, emotional response tracking. The documentation stretched back years. The realization hit everyone in the room at the same time. Juniper had not been raised. She had been managed. The officers continued collecting evidence throughout the afternoon. Every discovery strengthened the case. Every room revealed another layer of psychological control. Then a neighbor was interviewed. The testimony added another shocking piece to the puzzle. Residents rarely saw Juniper outside. When they did, she never spoke, never played, never interacted with other children. She moved quietly beside her mother and immediately returned indoors. Many neighbors assumed she was simply shy. Now they wondered how much had been happening behind closed doors all along. By evening, the investigation had expanded dramatically. Psychologists were reviewing evidence. Digital forensic teams were analyzing devices. Child welfare officials were preparing emergency recommendations. And the media had begun hearing rumors. News organizations started contacting local authorities. Questions were spreading. People wanted answers. The parenting influencer admired by thousands was suddenly under investigation. But the most heartbreaking development was happening miles away from the apartment. Back at the Child Support Center, Juniper sat quietly at a small table. For the first time in years, nobody was timing her. Nobody was grading her. Nobody was watching her through a camera. Yet she couldn't relax. She kept glancing toward corners of the room, looking upward, scanning walls, searching for surveillance equipment that wasn't there. The cameras had become part of her reality. Even in safety, she expected to be watched. A counselor gently placed a box of crayons in front of her. Juniper stared at them as though she had been handed something completely unfamiliar. The counselors soon learned why. The little girl had spent years studying colors, memorizing them, classifying them, describing them, but almost never using them. For the first time, she was being asked to create something instead of perform, and she didn't know how. As night approached, the investigation against Vivian Hale continued growing. Detectives believed they were only beginning to uncover the truth. Because hidden somewhere inside those thousands of files was the answer to a terrifying question. How far had Vivian been willing to go in her obsession with creating the perfect child? And when that answer finally surfaced, it would shock the entire country. While forensic teams continued digging through the mountain of evidence collected from Vivian Hale's apartment, a very different battle was unfolding across town. It was happening inside a child advocacy center. And the person fighting that battle was 6-year-old Juniper. For the first time in her life, nobody was demanding perfection from her. Nobody was assigning lessons. Nobody was timing her meals. Nobody was measuring her performance. Yet freedom felt unfamiliar. The staff quickly noticed something heartbreaking. Juniper didn't know how to be a child. Simple choices seemed impossible for her. When offered different foods, she asked which one she was supposed to choose. When invited to play, she waited for instructions. When handed art supplies, she froze. Years of conditioning had trained her to believe that every action had a correct answer and a wrong answer. The idea of making choices for herself felt dangerous. The counselors began documenting everything, not because they wanted to evaluate her, but because they were witnessing the effects of prolonged psychological control. The signs appeared everywhere. Juniper apologized constantly. She apologized for sitting down. She apologized for asking questions. She apologized for taking too long to think. Sometimes she apologized simply for existing. The adults around her found it devastating. Each apology sounded automatic, like a reflex that had been programmed into her mind. One afternoon, a therapist placed a blank sheet of paper in front of her and asked her to draw anything she wanted. The request seemed simple. For Juniper, it was terrifying. Several minutes passed. The paper remained empty. Finally, she admitted she didn't know what she was allowed to draw. That moment hit the therapists harder than almost anything else they had heard. A child who had memorized advanced academic subjects had never been given permission to imagine. As Juniper slowly began attending therapy sessions, more details emerged. The stories became increasingly disturbing. She described alarms that controlled her schedule, surveillance cameras that monitored her movements, rules she had been forced to memorize from an age when most children were still learning how to tie their shoes. There were rules about posture, rules about speaking, rules about eating, rules about sleeping, rules about emotions. Even happiness had conditions attached to it. The professionals listening to her realized something important. Vivian hadn't simply controlled Juniper's behavior. She had attempted to control her identity. Everything that made Juniper an individual had been systematically suppressed. Meanwhile, the investigation continued, uncovering shocking discoveries. Digital forensic specialists spent days reviewing the thousands of videos recovered from Vivian's computers. The footage revealed a pattern that was impossible to ignore. Every recording followed the same structure: performance, evaluation, correction, punishment, repeat. Hours and hours of footage showed Juniper being treated less like a daughter and more like a project under constant observation. One investigator later described the recordings as emotionally exhausting to watch. There were no moments of warmth, no spontaneous affection, no normal family interactions. Everything revolved around achievement. Everything revolved around results. Then investigators found another collection of files. These documents appeared to be drafts for a future book Vivian planned to publish. The contents stunned everyone. Entire chapters were dedicated to what she called behavioral optimization. She discussed reducing emotional dependency, eliminating weakness, replacing childhood impulses with discipline, creating exceptional outcomes through controlled environments. The language sounded clinical, cold, detached. What disturbed experts most was the fact that the theories weren't hypothetical. They were being tested on Juniper. The evidence suggested that Vivian genuinely believed she was creating something extraordinary. In reality, she was destroying her daughter's emotional development. The more authorities learned, the stronger the case became. But outside the investigation, another battle was beginning. The story leaked. At first, only local reporters heard whispers about a parenting influencer under investigation. Then national media became interested. Within days, the story exploded across television networks, podcasts, news websites, and social media platforms. America became fascinated. Some people were horrified. Others defended Vivian. The internet quickly divided into opposing camps. Supporters argued that modern children lacked discipline. Critics pointed to the growing evidence of abuse. Videos from Vivian's social media channels began circulating everywhere. Millions watched clips showing Juniper reciting information far beyond her age. To some viewers, it looked impressive. To others, it looked deeply unsettling. The debate intensified every day. Back at the Advocacy Center, staff tried their best to shield Juniper from the attention. But protecting her completely became impossible. One evening, a television in a hallway briefly aired coverage of the case. The moment Juniper heard her mother's voice, her entire body stiffened. Her reaction was immediate. Her hands began trembling. Her breathing changed. The fear was unmistakable. The staff quickly turned the television off. But the damage had already been done. That night, Juniper struggled to sleep. Counselors later learned she was terrified that her mother would somehow find her. Even though Vivian was under investigation, even though she was being monitored by authorities, even though she could not simply walk into the center, Juniper still believed she was never truly safe. That fear revealed how deeply the trauma had taken root. The following week, therapists introduced a new exercise. They encouraged Juniper to describe what her ideal home would look like. Most children immediately imagine toys, pets, games, or colorful bedrooms. Juniper's answer stunned everyone. She described silence. Not the silence of loneliness. The silence of safety. A place where nobody yelled. A place without cameras. A place where mistakes didn't matter. A place where she could sleep without fear. For several moments, nobody in the room spoke. The adults realized they were listening to a child whose greatest dream was not excitement. It was peace. As therapy continued, small changes began appearing. They were tiny at first, almost impossible to notice. One day, Juniper laughed at something another child said. The sound surprised even her. Another day, she chose a crayon without asking permission. Then she began drawing. At first, her pictures looked structured and controlled. Boxes, lines, schedules, rooms, rules. But gradually new elements appeared. Trees, clouds, birds, sunlight, open doors. The therapists recognized what was happening. For the first time, imagination was fighting its way through years of fear. Yet just as progress began emerging, investigators uncovered evidence that threatened to make the case even bigger. Hidden among the recovered files was a collection of recordings that had never been posted publicly. Private recordings. Raw footage. Unedited footage. Moments the public was never meant to see. And what appeared inside those recordings would soon transform the investigation from a disturbing custody case into one of the most shocking child abuse prosecutions the state had seen in years. The truth was finally coming into the light, and the darkest revelations were still waiting to be uncovered. As the investigation entered its second month, authorities believed they already had enough evidence to secure a conviction. They were wrong. What they discovered next would make the case far darker than anyone had imagined. Inside a secure forensic laboratory, investigators continued examining thousands of files recovered from Vivian Hale's computers and storage drives. The process was slow. Every recording had to be reviewed. Every document had to be analyzed. Hour after hour, specialists worked through the material. Then they found a hidden archive. Unlike the videos that had been uploaded to social media, these recordings had never been intended for public viewing. There were no polished edits, no motivational music, no carefully crafted image of a devoted mother, only raw reality. The footage revealed what happened when the cameras meant for the public were turned off. Investigators watched as Juniper struggled through exhaustion after long study sessions. They watched her fight to stay awake. They watched her become increasingly anxious whenever she made even the smallest mistake. Most disturbing of all, they saw a child who had become terrified of failure. The fear was constant. It was visible in every movement, every glance, every breath. Psychologists reviewing the material reached a troubling conclusion. Juniper wasn't simply trying to avoid punishment. She genuinely believed her value as a human being depended entirely on performance. Years of conditioning had convinced her that love had to be earned. That realization became one of the most important pieces of evidence in the case. The damage wasn't limited to bruises or physical discipline. The damage had reached the foundation of her identity. Meanwhile, another discovery sent shockwaves through the investigation. Authorities uncovered extensive planning documents created by Vivian. The files contained detailed projections for Juniper's future. Academic milestones, behavioral objectives, social restrictions, psychological targets. Everything was mapped out years in advance. The plans extended all the way into adulthood. According to the documents, Vivian intended to continue controlling nearly every aspect of her daughter's development for decades. Experts reviewing the material described it as one of the most extreme examples of parental domination they had ever encountered. The evidence was no longer pointing toward occasional abuse. It suggested a systematic effort to reshape a child's entire life. As news organizations learned more details, media coverage intensified. National networks began running daily updates. Major newspapers published investigative reports. Talk shows debated the case. Parenting experts appeared on television. The story spread across the country. Millions of Americans suddenly found themselves discussing Juniper Hale. Public opinion quickly became a battlefield. One side argued that strict parenting had been unfairly criminalized. The other side saw overwhelming evidence of abuse. The debate exploded online. Former followers of Vivian began abandoning her social media channels. Others defended her even more aggressively. Some supporters insisted she had simply pushed her daughter toward excellence. But every time new evidence became public, that defense became harder to maintain. Then came the release of several court-approved summaries from the investigation. The public learned about the cameras, the punishment journals, the monitoring systems, the behavioral tracking, the conditions under which Juniper had lived. The reaction was immediate. Support for Vivian started collapsing. Many people who had once admired her publicly admitted they had been deceived. Others expressed shock that such conditions could exist inside what appeared to be a successful middle-class home. Back at the Advocacy Center, however, none of that mattered to Juniper. She wasn't thinking about public opinion. She wasn't following the news. She was fighting a much more personal battle. Recovery. The process remained painfully slow. Although she was beginning to trust the staff around her, years of fear could not disappear overnight. Certain sounds still triggered anxiety. Footsteps in hallways. Doors opening unexpectedly. Raised voices from another room. Each incident reminded her of the environment she had escaped. The counselors understood that healing would take time. One afternoon, a therapist conducted a simple exercise. Juniper was asked to describe herself. The room became quiet. Several seconds passed. Then several more. The little girl struggled to answer. She could describe academic subjects. She could list hundreds of rules. She could recite information far beyond her age. But she could not explain who she was. The realization devastated the professionals working with her. Years of control had erased much of her sense of self. The child had been taught what to think, what to say, what to learn, what to fear. But she had never been allowed to discover her own identity. The therapists adjusted their treatment plan immediately. The goal was no longer simply helping Juniper recover from trauma. The goal was helping her discover who she was beyond the expectations imposed upon her. Small victories slowly began appearing. She started choosing her own clothes. She began expressing preferences. She developed favorite colors, favorite foods, favorite activities. Each decision represented something precious. Freedom. At the same time, prosecutors were preparing for trial. Their case was growing stronger every week. Medical evaluations, psychological assessments, digital evidence, witness testimony. Everything pointed toward a clear pattern of long-term abuse. Yet prosecutors knew the defense would not surrender easily. Vivian had resources. She had supporters. She had lawyers willing to challenge every accusation. And she remained completely convinced that she had done nothing wrong. That belief worried investigators more than anything else. Because throughout months of interviews and legal proceedings, Vivian never expressed regret. Never acknowledged harm. Never admitted mistakes. She continued insisting that every action had been justified. Every punishment had served a purpose. Every sacrifice had been necessary. The absence of remorse became impossible to ignore. Then, only weeks before trial, another development changed everything. A former employee who had occasionally worked with Vivian's media production team agreed to cooperate with authorities. The witness provided new information about what happened behind the scenes. Information the public had never heard before. Information that would soon become one of the most explosive moments of the entire case. Prosecutors immediately added the testimony to their growing evidence file. Investigators realized they were about to expose an even larger truth. Not only had Juniper been living inside a carefully controlled world, that world had been deliberately hidden from millions of people watching online. The perfect image was beginning to crack. And when the courtroom finally opened its doors, the full story would emerge for everyone to see. What had started as one little girl's desperate walk to a police station was about to become a legal battle that would captivate the entire nation. And the most dramatic chapter had not even begun yet. The trial began on a rainy Monday morning. Long before the courthouse doors opened, reporters had already gathered outside. Satellite trucks lined the streets. Camera crews competed for the best position. National media outlets sent correspondents from across the country. What had started as a single report involving a frightened 6-year-old girl had become one of the most closely watched child abuse cases in America. Inside the courthouse, the atmosphere felt completely different. There were no headlines, no social media debates, no television panels, only evidence, facts, and the fate of a little girl whose entire childhood had been shaped by fear. Prosecutors entered the courtroom carrying months of investigation results, boxes of documents, digital records, medical evaluations, psychological assessments, thousands of pages detailing the life Juniper had lived behind closed doors. Across the room sat Vivian Hale. She looked calm, controlled, almost identical to the image millions of followers had seen online for years. Observers expected signs of anxiety or uncertainty. Instead, they saw confidence. That confidence would slowly begin to disappear as the evidence unfolded. The prosecution moved methodically. First came the physical evidence recovered from the apartment, the surveillance systems, the behavioral journals, the daily schedules. The investigators explained how every hour of Juniper's life had been controlled. Every action had been monitored. Every mistake had been documented. Every weakness had been targeted. Then came the testimony of psychologists. Their conclusions struck the courtroom with tremendous force. Experts described a child who had been deprived of normal emotional development. A child who had learned to associate love with achievement. A child who believed mistakes made her unworthy. A child who had become terrified of her own humanity. The courtroom remained silent as specialists explained the long-term consequences. Anxiety, hypervigilance, emotional suppression, identity confusion, trauma responses. Many jurors took extensive notes. Others simply listened with expressions that grew more troubled by the hour. The prosecution then introduced the digital evidence. Video after video appeared on large courtroom screens. not the carefully edited content shared online. The private recordings. The recordings never intended for public consumption. The difference was impossible to ignore. The public videos showed discipline. The private footage revealed obsession. The public image showed structure. The hidden recordings showed control. As jurors watched clip after clip, a disturbing pattern emerged. Juniper was never allowed to simply be a child. There was always another lesson, another correction, another evaluation, another demand. The pressure never stopped. The atmosphere inside the courtroom became heavier with every passing day. Yet the most devastating testimony was still ahead. Prosecutors called several child trauma specialists who had spent months working directly with Juniper. They described what happened after she entered protective care. The jury learned how difficult simple choices had become for her. How she asked permission for ordinary activities. How she apologized constantly. How she struggled to identify her own preferences. How she remained frightened of invisible cameras long after leaving the apartment. The experts explained that these behaviors were not isolated incidents. They were symptoms of prolonged psychological conditioning. Symptoms that had developed over years. The testimony painted a picture far more powerful than any headline ever could. It showed the human cost. The cost paid by a little girl whose childhood had slowly been replaced by performance requirements and fear. Then the prosecution revealed one of its strongest witnesses. A former member of Vivian's content production team. The courtroom immediately became alert. For months, investigators had hinted that someone from behind the scenes possessed information capable of changing the entire case. Now that person was finally taking the stand. The witness described an environment very different from the one presented online. According to the testimony, many recordings were carefully staged. Hours of pressure often occurred before successful clips were captured. Failed attempts were deleted. Emotional breakdowns never appeared in public content. Only perfection was allowed to survive. The witness described concerns that had existed for years. Concerns nobody had reported. Concerns people had convinced themselves were not their responsibility. That testimony sent shock waves through the courtroom. For the first time, the jury began seeing how the public image had been constructed. The carefully curated videos. The inspirational messages. The claims of success. All of it suddenly looked very different. The defense fought back aggressively. Vivian's attorneys argued that she had simply adopted an extreme educational philosophy. They claimed she had never intended harm. They insisted that every decision had been motivated by love and ambition. For a brief moment, uncertainty entered the courtroom. Then prosecutors introduced another collection of evidence. Private writings recovered from Vivian's computer. The documents contained years of observations about Juniper. Performance evaluations. Behavioral analysis. Correction plans. Emotional tracking systems. What shocked jurors was the language. Again and again, the child was described almost as a project. A subject. An objective. Rarely as a daughter. Rarely as a little girl. Rarely as a human being with needs beyond achievement. The distinction proved devastating. One by one, the defense arguments began collapsing. But the most emotional moment arrived near the end of the trial. Because although Juniper was protected from direct courtroom exposure as much as possible, portions of her recorded statements were introduced into evidence. The room listened as experts described her fear, her exhaustion, her loneliness, her belief that she had somehow failed simply by being a child. The impact was immediate. Even experienced court personnel later admitted the testimony was difficult to hear. By the time closing arguments arrived, the atmosphere inside the courtroom had completely changed. The focus was no longer on parenting philosophies. It was no longer about educational methods. It was no longer about discipline. The central question had become much simpler. Had a child been harmed? The evidence overwhelmingly pointed toward one answer. Outside, news coverage intensified every day. Across America, people waited for the verdict. Millions followed updates. Millions debated outcomes. Millions wondered what justice would look like for Juniper. Inside the courthouse, the jury disappeared to begin deliberations. Hours passed. Then an entire day. Then another. The wait felt endless. For prosecutors. For investigators. For therapists. For everyone who had worked to protect Juniper. No one knew what decision would emerge when the jury finally returned. But one thing had become clear. Regardless of the verdict, the truth could never be hidden again. The perfect image had shattered. The carefully constructed illusion had collapsed. And somewhere beyond the courthouse walls, a little girl who had once been afraid to make a mistake was waiting to learn whether the future would finally belong to her. The answer was now only one verdict away. The morning the verdict was scheduled to be announced, the courthouse was surrounded by reporters, legal analysts, and members of the public who had followed the case for months. By then, the story of Juniper Hale had spread far beyond New Mexico. People across America knew her name. Many knew the details of her suffering. Many had watched the debate unfold. But on that day, none of the attention mattered to Juniper. She was not thinking about headlines. She was not thinking about television coverage. She was not thinking about social media. She was thinking about one thing: whether she would ever have to go back. Inside a private waiting room away from cameras and crowds, Juniper sat quietly beside the adults who had helped her rebuild her life. The little girl who had walked into a police station months earlier was no longer exactly the same child. The fear was still there. The memories were still there. The scars were still there. But something else had appeared alongside them. Hope. It had arrived slowly, one small step at a time, through therapy sessions, through patient conversations, through simple acts of kindness, through people who expected nothing from her except that she be herself. For the first time in her life, Juniper had begun discovering who she was when nobody was grading her existence. The courtroom eventually filled. The jury entered. The atmosphere became tense. Months of investigation, testimony, evidence, and argument had led to this moment. Every person inside understood the importance of what was about to happen. The judge reviewed the findings. The jury's conclusions were clear. The evidence demonstrated a sustained pattern of abuse. The evidence demonstrated long-term psychological harm. The evidence demonstrated systematic control that had damaged a child's emotional development. The verdict left little room for doubt. Vivian Hale was found guilty. As the decision was read into the record, a chapter that had dominated national attention finally came to an end. For investigators, it represented justice. For prosecutors, it represented accountability. For child advocates, it represented protection. For Juniper, it represented something even more important: freedom. The legal system imposed a lengthy prison sentence. Additional orders permanently restricted future contact. The court also established long-term protections designed to ensure Juniper's safety and stability. When the proceedings ended, the media rushed to report every detail. News alerts spread nationwide within minutes. Television anchors interrupted programming. Websites published breaking updates. For many Americans, the verdict felt significant because it challenged a dangerous idea. The idea that abuse could be disguised as excellence. The idea that control could be mistaken for love. The idea that achievement mattered more than childhood. But while the country discussed the case, Juniper quietly continued her own journey. The spotlight gradually moved elsewhere. The cameras disappeared. The reporters left. The headlines faded. Life became quieter. And that quiet turned out to be exactly what she needed. Over the following months, therapists noticed remarkable progress. Not dramatic changes. Not movie-like transformations. Real changes. Healthy changes. The kind that happen slowly. The kind that last. Juniper began sleeping through entire nights without waking in panic. She stopped checking rooms for hidden cameras. She stopped apologizing every few minutes. She started laughing more often. She started asking questions. She started expressing opinions. Most importantly, she began making mistakes without fear. To most people, that sounds ordinary. For Juniper, it was revolutionary. Every mistake became proof that punishment would not follow. Every imperfect drawing became proof that she was safe. Every wrong answer became proof that her worth did not depend on performance. Therapists often say that trauma steals pieces of a person's identity. In Juniper's case, they watched those pieces slowly return. She developed favorite books, favorite foods, favorite colors, favorite songs, things she had never been allowed to choose before. One day, during an art session, she drew a picture that caught everyone's attention. The drawing showed a small bird standing near an open cage. Unlike previous drawings, the bird was not trapped. The door stood wide open. The bird had not flown away yet. But it could. The image perfectly reflected where Juniper was in her recovery. Safe. Free. Still healing. Still learning. But no longer trapped. As the year continued, another important decision was made. After extensive evaluation, the court approved a permanent guardianship arrangement with Teresa Monroe, one of the child advocates who had become an important part of Juniper's support system. Teresa had spent countless hours helping the little girl through therapy, fear, uncertainty, and recovery. Trust had formed naturally. The transition felt less like a legal decision and more like the next step in a relationship already built on care and stability. For the first time, Juniper was entering a home where expectations were measured differently. Not by grades. Not by achievements. Not by perfection. But by happiness. The true turning point arrived several months later. Juniper celebrated a birthday. To many children, birthdays are ordinary. To Juniper, it was a completely new experience. There were balloons. There was cake. There were decorations. There were gifts. There were people smiling simply because she existed. No exams. No evaluations. No performance requirements. No conditions. The celebration was small, but it carried enormous meaning. As she looked around the room, she saw something she had spent years searching for without understanding what it was. Belonging. Not because she had earned it. Not because she had achieved something. Not because she had been perfect. Simply because she was loved. The frightened 6-year-old who once memorized city streets in order to escape had finally found something she never had inside that carefully controlled apartment. A real childhood. Years later, many people would remember the investigation. Many would remember the trial. Many would remember the shocking evidence. But those who knew the full story understood that the most important part was not the conviction. It was what happened afterward. A little girl who had been treated like a project learned she was a person. A child who had been taught to fear failure learned she was allowed to make mistakes. A survivor who once believed she had to earn love discovered that real love asks for nothing in return. And on a quiet evening, far away from courtrooms and television cameras, Juniper sat beneath a purple sunset, smiling as she looked toward a future that finally belonged to her. For the first time in her life, she wasn't being watched. She wasn't being judged. She wasn't being measured. She was simply living. And that was the greatest victory of all.